And I thought it interesting that right in the beginning of the book, they talk about otters.
Yes.
And I found that significant. With the way I looked at that is when we look at things in a four-step inventory. We make a searching, fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And what we attempt to do is identify the character defects and weaknesses that we have that are preventing us from moving ahead, okay, in our lives. And I took this as saying that the otters are much like character defects and weaknesses that we want to root out of our lives.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a brilliant analysis because what why Piscator is talking about the otters that way is because they cause, well, according to him, they eat so many fish and they cause, well, if you will, the fish environment to suffer, right? And there are too many otters, they breed like bunny rabbits, that we need to get rid of them, or we need to get rid of them as much as possible. And so he's talking about something that's exactly what you're talking about.
So we're getting rid of the vexations in our lives.
Yes, right.
And I'm going to read this paragraph if I could. Piscator said, "Sir, there are many men that are by others taken to be serious, grave men, which we condemn and pity, men of sour complexion, money-getting men that spend all of their time first in getting and next in anxious care in keeping it. Men that are condemned to be rich and always discontented or busy. For these poor rich men, we anglers pity them and stand in no need to borrow their thoughts to think of themselves happy. So we enjoy a contentedness above the reach of such dispositions." So what I'm hearing Piscator saying is, here's something that we recognize and we choose not to participate in. We don't want to have that in our lives, and really and truly, we'll avoid that company.
Yeah. And what Walton is also saying, and what he says throughout the book, or I should say, what you get from reading the entire book, is that fishing, angling, is such a difficult sport, fishing well, especially trout fishing and fly fishing, that once you learn all the details, but it's something you have to spend a lot of time doing. You can't just shoot a gun. You have to stand by the river for a long time. You have to think about the best way to get the trout, and on and on and on. That's why he calls it a contemplative recreation. And it's not something you can have right away, like money grabbing or things like that.
I love the way that Piscator talks about ego deflation in here
Right.
also. When he talks in the next paragraph about his cat, about
Yes.
playing with his cat,
Yeah.
and obviously his cat can't talk. And some people view animals as dumb. I'm sure you've heard people refer to other dumb animals,
Right.
and mainly dumb meaning cannot speak. Okay. However, Piscator looks at it from a totally other perspective and say, perhaps the defect is my not understanding her language.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And by extrapolation, we can think, well, he doesn't. We, meaning us, don't understand the language of deer. We don't understand the language of trouts or fish or any other animal. And one of the things that's important to be woke about is just because you don't hear something necessarily, that doesn't mean you don't understand it, or that the person involved is dumb or intellectually inferior.
Indeed. And what Piscator talks about is making things simpler, not more difficult,
Yes. Yes, that's right.
about over encumbrance with rules. And I love the where he talks about uh, men that lived in those times when there were fewer lawyers.
Yes, that's right.
For then a lordship might have been safely conveyed on a piece of parchment no bigger than your hand, though several skins are not sufficient to do it in this wiser age.
Yeah, that was exactly the passage I was going to read because he talks about exactly what the point of angling is. And for angling, we can take that to mean leading the contemplative life.
Well, and quite often, if you look at any books in Buddhism, Buddhist monks, Buddhist thought, they often have a picture of a monk fishing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And as Walton slash Piscator says throughout the book, you know, sacred texts often talk about people fishing. They often talk about, Jonah in the whale. They talk about give a man a fish, or teach him to fish. He could feed his for a lifetime, and on and on. There are all these sorts of religious philosophical references to fishing, but there aren't very many to hunting. There aren't very many to falconry. And I mean, it is something that is different in that way. It takes a lot more time and it takes a lot more thought, and that gives you time to recognize the
And
beauty in all of it,
patience.
and patience, and recognize. So you end up recognizing all the beauty in this.
And the reference to the fish. The Bible's Jesus fed the
Right,
multitudes
right,
with fish. Jesus told his disciples he was going to make them fishers of men.
right. Exactly. And that doesn't go unnoticed by Walton. He brings it up several times.
Piscator has some reasonable thoughts about Viator also, saying that the question will rather be whether you are capable of learning it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're not capable, as you've said so many times on this show in other episodes, if you're not capable or you're not willing to stop and make the effort to learn and make the effort to listen, and so often, so many of us think that listening is something you can do automatically, but it's not. Listening in the right way is an effort.
We often talk about this show, and I certainly make no claim to any of this as original. 90% of communication is active listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
90% of it.
Yeah.
No one in the history of the world, professor, has ever learned anything by talking.
No, that's right. That's right. That's right.
So what we're talking about here is the action and effort, and we're talking about Viator have the willingness to try. So I often tell this story too about having an open mind and having a dry sponge mind, where Socrates went to the Oracle of Delphi
Mm-hmm.
to ask the
Mm-hmm.
question. Okay. And when he came back, the people in Athens said, well, what did they tell you? And Socrates said, well, they told me that I was the wisest man in the world. And people said, wow, what do you make of that? And Socrates says that I'm the only one who truly understands his own ignorance.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
what he was asking Viator to open your mind up,
Yeah.
empty the glass, and let's fill it.
Yeah. And even Piscator admits that he doesn't, even though his knowledge of fishing is obviously encyclopedic. I mean, it's amazing how much he knows about different types of fish and different ways of catching them. But he acknowledges again and again and again that it is infinite. To learn, to know everything about fishing would take several lifetimes.
Well, Professor, we're getting into one of the most fascinating parts of this book, I believe, where Piscator goes into a discourse on contemplation versus action.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And as you say, as it's very clear in the book, he talks about contemplation a little bit in the beginning, a little bit, and sort of builds it up. But then it comes to this point where he says, look, contemplation is everything, but then the action the things you put into action will not only be ends in themselves, but will lead to further and better contemplation.
And I think he wraps it up very nicely when he says that I shall forbear in adding a third by declaring my own, and rest myself contented in telling you, my worthy friend, that both these meet together and do most properly belong to the most honest, ingenious, harmless act of angling, and that's synergy. That's what
Yes,
contemplative
absolutely.
action.
Yeah.
So we often, for people who haven't tuned into this show before, we tell this story many times. There was a person who prayed to win the lottery every day, and nothing ever happened. So they got so angry one day that they went outside and they yelled up at this guy, God, won't you let me win the lottery? And God called back down and said, could you meet me halfway and at least buy a ticket? So you can contemplate about winning the lottery. However, it's not going to happen unless you buy the ticket.
Right. That's right.
So I believe that's what my interpretation is of that.
Well, and that's another strength of the book, is that there are so many valid interpretations you can draw out of it that work in so many work in parallel with so many great philosophical ideas. The lottery joke is a joke, but it's also, if you think more deeply about it, something very, 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 very serious.
We go back to the 12-step world. You can have all the contemplative action about stopping or using whatever you're doing in your life
Hmm.
that's causing you distress. But unless you take the actual steps to do it, nothing's going to
That's
happen.
right. Yeah.
Uh, just today, and sometimes what I'll do when people, well, I'll think this through. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I have is I have a picture of Rodin's The Thinker. Okay.
Yes. Right.
And
Yeah.
I give it to them and I say, I want you to keep this. And they say, how come? I said, well, this sculpture was carved hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And you know what? That guy's still thinking.
Yes. Right. And he's just sitting there.
He's still sitting there.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So we often talk here about people getting trapped in their thoughts,
Yep.
and much as what history is taught and read is that simply because we have a thought doesn't make it true, and simply because you read about history in a book not doesn't necessarily make that true.
No, very often you have to keep reading more and more and more and analyzing more and more and more to find out to get as close to the truth as possible in history.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing, and that's why I get the big money.
Well, one of the ideas is that you help people, you show people the way. Okay. And it's often been said that the best teachers don't tell people what to read, show them the way, but they don't tell them what to read. Okay. I'm sure
Right.
you've pointed many people in the direction.
Basically, in two ways, we try to tell people again and again that it's almost always more complicated than any book or any article summarize it as, and there's always more digging to do. So while we do recommend certain books on certain
Hmm.
topics, we encourage people to keep going because it is endless, and but the further you get along, the further you go along, the better it becomes and the clearer it becomes.
So, quite often, Professor, what we often talk about this show too is that most people view selfishness as some type of a real character defect. However, we often use the story about when you've been on airplanes before, I'm sure.
Yep.
Okay, so when a flight attendant comes out and gives the oxygen mask instructions, who do they tell you to put the mask on first?
Yourself first. Yeah, sure.
Yes. Most people will say your children or the neighbor, but if
Yeah.
they listen carefully, they tell them to put it on first. So quite often on this show, what we encourage people to is to invest in themselves,
Yeah.
is to be the gardener of their life, so they have something to give away. And where Piscator says, uh, and just it is that I should pay the rent because the benefit accrues me.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Pay yourself first.
Yeah.
Any financial expert would tell you pay yourself first.
Yeah.
No matter what that is, 1%, 10%, whatever it is, pay yourself first.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't become part of your soul unless you pay yourself first.
Indeed. Indeed.
And like you say with the mask, you can't help other people until you pay yourself first. The
So
oxygen mask, I should say.
it's amazing. So in the 12-step world, what we talk about is the message that can interest and hold these people must have depth and weight.
Mhm.
And that's what I'm seeing in this book.
Yeah, well, you can't get much more, at least about fishing, much more about depth and weight than this book because he talks about not only each fish in each type of river, as I said, in great detail, but he then talks about how to catch them, and then how those fish can be prepared for dinner, and
That's
in that,
amazing.
and even then he says at the end of the day, there's a whole lot more to learn.
Well, at times Piscator becomes concerned that he's throwing too much information.
Yes, that's right. And but Viator or Venator, depending on which edition you have, says no, 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 I want more, and that's his strength as a character because he's sort of changing away from hunting and towards fishing because Piscator is showing him the depths.
And he says, and Viator said, "Sir, take what liberty you think fit, for your discourse seems to be music and charms me into an attention."
Yeah, yeah.
Isn't that beautiful language?
A beautiful language, and I don't know anything about hunting either, but I think even hunters would agree that fishing is more complicated.
Well, I'm not, please don't think that we're throwing stones at hunters, but my
No,
father and I, at 12, we went hunting like a 12-year-old boy wants to do.
sure.
So this was a time before you had to have these training courses and things. We went into the woods, and after half an hour, without even loading the guns, we decided that we were more dangerous to ourselves than we were to anything in that woods, and we never went out again. I've never hunted again.
Right. Right. Well, there you go.
However, I have fished.
Well, yeah, I would think people wouldn't say that about fishing.
And the deal is, it doesn't matter to me whether I catch any fish or not.
No, yeah. Yeah.
That's the beautiful part of
And
this
I
book.
think every fisherman I've ever spoken to, especially fly fishermen, will say that, of course, catching is wonderful and all that sort of thing. But, they spend 99% of their time preparing and waiting and actually doing the angling part of fishing rather than the catching and the reeling or the pulling in. So I think then that's where they get their satisfaction.
Indeed. And he often talks about angling as being observant and contemplative.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing things. Amazing things.
Well, and it also goes back to where I was originally exposed to the book through golf, which sounds crazy, but especially when you walk the golf course, as I've always done my whole life, you spend a second on the actual shot, but you spend hours contemplating the shots contemplating what you're going to do and how to do it between the shots.
So Piscator prefers to be in the company of people who express themselves thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
On 15, he said, "Sir, to speak truly, he is not to me, for most of his conceits were either scripture jests or lavacious jests, for which I count no man witty."
Mm-hmm.
He has expectations. So sometimes, Professor, what I'll do is a exercise in self-validation for people, particularly with young ladies, as we've discussed on this show many times. Young ladies begin to lose their self-concept and self-esteem around the age of 9 years old. So what I'll have them do is prepare a profile, not to put themselves out what I have to offer,
Mm-hmm.
but I have them make a list of requirements that it takes to be with me.
All
What are the
right.
requirements it takes to be with me? So Piscator is laying out the requirements that it
Yeah.
takes to be with him.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, 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 yeah. And who knows how many people he would have in his life walking between different towns or walking between fishing trips, how many people he would have met and spoken to that didn't live up to those standards or weren't willing to put in the time of listening, as you say.
And I think he goes further on to talk about modeling behavior.
Yeah.
But for such discourse, as we heard last night when they were in the inn, it infects others. And the very boys will learn to talk and swear like they'd heard mine host.
Right. Exactly.
Modeling behavior.
Yeah. Exactly.
We often talk about time traveling on this show, Professor, where the time machine is right in your mind. However, if I had a few moments to go back in time, I think I'd like to go fishing with Izaak.
Yes, that would be a wonderful thing to do.
Indeed. So, when you tell us about the first time that you read this book.
Again, it came to me through golf, which is also contemplative, if you want to take it that way, and it was at a time when I was finding a number of characters, shall we say, in history, a number of people in history who were taking these steps. They were taking the steps of not only doing something politically, but also then writing philosophically about it. And we see this in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. We see it later in the 18th century in the United States, what becomes the United States, and on and on and on. And was a great deepening period for me because I thought that not only is there a lot more to this, there can be a lot more to me, and so that's why I've kept reading it. Frankly, it's because you draw out not only so much about nature and life in the book, you draw out so much about yourself.
Well, as your own life experiences go on, the real mark of an excellent literature is that you can go back and read it again and you will find some other meaning to it that you didn't notice the first time.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember because it was the early 80s when I was in college that I first read it, but what stuck with me so strongly was you're going to read this again and again and again the rest of your life, and that's what I've done.
Well, it's like the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's only 164 pages of the basic text. However, every time, at least when I pick it up, I find something different or it speaks to me in another way.
Yeah. And you think more, it's one of these books where you think carefully about its broader meaning. And that's why I think it's whatever it is, the third most printed book or the third most bought book or the third most read book in the English language.
And what he talks about, when people deal with adversity, we talk a lot about adversity, dealing with adversity on this show.
Mm-hmm.
People can deal with it many ways. And Piscator introduces the concept of flexibility and adapting as when he goes into a discourse on how to prepare a grasshopper as bait.
Yes, that's right.
But then Viator says, well, master, what if I have not found a grasshopper?
Yeah.
So he talks to him about improvising, that his world isn't over. It's not the end of the world.
No, right.
He points him in another direction.
Yeah. And also he goes on at different points in the book, maybe a little bit later in that edition, about how to tie the right kind of flies that will imitate the type of grasshopper or the type of insect the right way to catch a certain type of trout. And that in itself is a hugely time consuming and but also I think very calming hobby. There are lots of people I know who don't even fish, but whose whole sort of, well, they fish very rarely, but their whole joy is about tying flies. And you can see this, there was that terrible movie, Fly Fishing in Wyoming. I can't remember the name of it, but people who spend all their times and they actually get out microscopes and they work on tying the flies. It becomes something that calms their mind.
Please check out our website at fishingwithoutbait.com, where you can listen to the show, comment on our discussions, and find out where you can subscribe to our podcast. If you're interested in flying the colors of Fishing Without Bait, click the shop icon on our website. We have clothing, mugs, cell phone cases, and so much more. Show the world that you fish without bait. This show is a member of the Sorgatron Media Podcast Network. Find out more at sorgatronmedia.com.